Okay, here is an explanation of what we are now calling the CAPA sequence. The CAPA sequence is a way to teach grammar while in the context of meaningful content, which is fundamentally what immersion and dual language programs are about. Teachers need to teach academic content, the content curriculum, meeting content standards for the state. At the same time, we know that it's really important for teachers to learn ways to help the kids develop better understandings of how the language works. And so this is a process where essentially you learn to teach a grammatical form, but in the context of meaningful content. I want to acknowledge Roy Lister here. Roy is a Canadian scholar, and he developed this instructional sequence that he used to call it, and then he and I are currently working on a book. I'm dietetic, by the way. He and I are currently working on a book and have decided to call this differently, to actually have an acronym for it, a CAPA sequence. And we've added to it quite substantially. So I would definitely want to acknowledge Roy here, because a lot of this comes from his really good thinking. And then the majority of the examples that I'm going to show you and provide you with are developed by teachers that I have worked with here at the University of Minnesota. I also want to acknowledge Tara Fortune. She and I presented on the instructional sequence a number of times some years ago, and even though it has changed pretty dramatically, there are some slides that she and I developed together that, so I still want to acknowledge her participation here. Okay, so first of all, one of the things that's important to remember about immersion in dual language, or DLI, I'll just call it DLI, is that we know that students can learn content through the second language as well as if they were learning it through the first language. That's what the research shows us. The research has told us that these kids do as well as or better than non-DLI kids on academic achievement measures, typically administered in English. So because of that, sometimes, and actually Lightbound and Spada specifically have called this a 2-for-1 approach. 2-for-1 meaning that, gee, all you have to do is use the language to teach content, and they get both the language and the content. However, Tedek and Lister, as we point out in our forthcoming book, say that nothing comes for free. In other words, learning the content through the second language doesn't mean that the second language just gets thrown in for free. Teachers actually have to do things differently. They have to write language objectives. They have to attend to language as they're teaching. They have to learn how to teach grammar differently, and so on and so forth. We want to make sure that kids are learning language in the context of these programs, and the research has been very, very clear that attention still needs to be drawn to the second language. It needs to be manipulated and enhanced during content teaching, because the research has shown us that kids in DLI programs develop fluency and confidence in learning a second language, but they have grammatical issues, lots of inaccuracies and so on. Even native speakers that are in two-way contexts, so native Spanish speakers, for example, develop inaccuracies in their Spanish and need to develop better metalinguistic awareness, and also need to be able to make sure that they're using forms accurately as well. Now, they're going to be able to produce most forms accurately, sort of on an intuitive level, but this kind of CAPA sequence can even help them develop more metalinguistic awareness. So as second language learners of the language are learning the form and metalinguistic awareness, we might be focusing more on metalinguistic awareness for those native speakers who are in our two-way programs. And what we know is that without well-planned language activities, content can be learned, but that second language proficiency may not be good as it could be. Okay, so I just want to very briefly introduce this whole notion of instructional counterbalance. A counterbalance is a power or influence that balances the effect of a contrary one, right? And this whole notion of a counterbalance was developed by Roy Lister some years ago, notably with his 2007 book. And the idea is that you're giving language and content objectives equal and complementary status. You're balancing students' awareness of learning both language and content together in these DLI programs. And teachers learn to integrate form-focused and content-based instruction. DLI teachers are brilliant at content-based instruction. What they need more practice with is how to focus on form, or grammar that is, or language, in the context of that content-based instruction. And that's fundamentally what the CAPA sequence is about. But the idea behind counterbalance instruction is that it pushes learners in contexts that are meaning-oriented in the opposite direction to strike a balance between the two orientations. So for example, in the DLI context, they're very meaning-oriented. We're very, very focused on content. And what we try to do with counterbalanced instruction is to raise students' awareness of language, and bring their attention more to language while they're learning content, so that we're balancing language and content a bit more. And this provides for what's called transfer-appropriate learning. Transfer-appropriate processing or learning means that the context in which learning occurs should resemble the context in which the learning will be put to use. I'll give you an example here that'll clarify that in just a few minutes. So language features that are learned in isolated grammar lessons are remembered in similar contexts, but then it's hard to retrieve that information in the context of communicative interaction. So for example, when I think back to the years of my learning Spanish in a very traditional way, I learned how to conjugate verbs, right? And so I was able to, the teacher would give us a tense, and then we would have to conjugate. She would give us, 5 verbs, and we would have to conjugate all of the verbs in that particular tense, and so on. And it became very automatic. I was good at it. But then when it came time to actually try to use that language in any kind of spontaneous and meaningful way, it was really hard. I got really good at conjugating verbs in an isolated way because that's what I was being taught to do. But then it was really hard to then pull up the correct conjugation in communicative interaction. And so the idea behind this CAPA sequence is to instead teach students a particular grammatical feature within the kind of interaction we want them to be engaged in. So we are going to teach them how to use this form in a more communicative way. And then the hope is that because they're being taught the form in this communicative context, then they will more easily be able to retrieve the accurate use of that form when they are communicating spontaneously. At least that's the theory behind this. So it's an important thought. So again, the whole idea of a counterbalanced approach is to try to bring more into balance meaning and form. We're very meaning heavy in DLI context, and the idea is to push up some of that form, try to bring in more of a focus on form so that we bring the two more into balance. So again, this counterbalance instruction balances a focus on form and meaning across 3 components in the curriculum: instructional input, student production or output, and the interactional feedback that a teacher gives. The kinds of ways that a teacher attends to student inaccuracies and so on in the context of classroom interaction. And then the CAPA sequence provides a way to teach a linguistic form or grammatical subsystem in the context of content instruction in the DLI classroom, not as a separate grammar lesson. We see sometimes in DLI programs that during language arts instruction, the teachers will give some sort of isolated grammar lesson on a particular problematic linguistic form, and then they want students to be able to apply their understanding of that form when they're doing content again. And we find through the research that that just doesn't work very well because, again, it doesn't provide for that transfer-appropriate learning that is so necessary. All right, so now that I have given you a bit of background here, let me focus now on the CAPA sequence itself. And this is described in a book that Roy and I are working on that should be available at some point next year, maybe in the fall, because it's due late spring this year. Okay, so the idea is that the CAPA sequence involves 4 different phases. The contextualization phase establishes a meaningful context that's related to the content by means of a text that has been adapted. If the form isn't salient and frequent enough in the text, then the text is adapted a little bit to make that more salient. And then in the awareness phase, students learn to notice and to reflect on the target features in a way that helps them discover patterns governing their use in the text. And then practice provides opportunities for students to use the target features in a meaningful yet controlled context and to receive corrective feedback. And then autonomy, the autonomy phase, helps students develop fluency and confidence as they use the target features in a discipline-specific or thematic context. So for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the contextualization and awareness phases, the first 2 that you see here in this figure. And then you can see that in the awareness and practice phases is when we're really homing in on that focus on language. This idea of the CAPA sequence corresponds really nicely to Pauline Gibbons' hourglass metaphor for the fact that in DLI contexts, we have students focus on meaning first, always focus on meaning first, where they're learning through language, and then an opportunity to home in on form, where they're learning about language, and then back to learning through language, where we expect them to apply their understanding of how that form works in a more communicative way as they use language to talk about their content understandings. And this is exactly the sort of format that the CAPA sequence follows. As you can see here, I've set it up more like an hourglass to show that the connection to Gibbons' metaphor. And you can see that the contextualization and autonomous phases are very much focused on content, while the awareness and practice phases are focused more on language, but always in the context of that meaningful content. Okay, so first let's talk about contextualization. So contextualization is where you identify a subject matter theme and some kind of text that's going to be used to contextualize focus on a problematic linguistic feature, okay? So which features merit focused attention? So let me talk just for the next couple of slides, talk about the kinds of things that you might want to take into consideration when you start thinking about the kinds of forms that students have difficulty with in your classrooms. So consider language forms that differ in non-obvious or unexpected ways. So for example, in Spanish, we have 2 different ways to say to be. We have the verb ser and the verb estar, and they're used in different contexts. The same with 2 different verbs for the word to know in English, or the way that we use the verb gustar. Gustar is translated as it is, to be pleasing to. To be pleasing to, right? So it functions very differently than the way that we translate that in English, which is like, I like. At any rate, it really becomes very problematic for learners as they're learning that. Another thing that happens is to take into consideration are forms that are regular in surface and frequently during classroom interactions. So for example, the formal and informal forms of you that exist in French and Spanish and other languages as well. So tu versus vous, or tú versus usted. Students, we've learned from the research that students don't know how to use these properly. And also forms that don't carry a heavy communicative load, so they're easily ignored. So for example, issues related to grammatical gender. So we know that there are some endings. We often know, in Spanish, for example, we know that most words that end in A are feminine, but that's not the case with some forms, like un día is masculine, not feminine, right? Okay, so it's an irregular. So irregular kinds of forms. Also, you want to consider forms that give access to a much larger set of possible communications. So the use of to be and to have. So we know that in Spanish, for example, describing your state, whether you're thirsty or hungry or etc. Sorry, I'm blanking on examples here. At any rate, those use the verb to have in Spanish, whereas we would use the verb to be in English. And once you teach a pattern there and you teach the kids the various expressions that take to have, you're giving them access to a much larger set of possible communications. Another thing you might want to consider are forms that create confusion or annoyance with native speakers. So we know that in French, when a kid says "je suis fini," they're trying to say "I'm finished," but what that literally means in French is "I'm dead." And the way to say I'm finished is to say I have finished, right? And it functions the same way in Spanish as well. So those can be really annoying to native speakers and create a lot of confusion. And then finally, attend to language issues when learners are cognitively and metalinguistically capable of benefiting from the instructional focus. So you want to make sure, for example, that you're not choosing to teach the subjunctive forms of verbs to kindergartners, right? Subjunctive is a very complex grammatical mood, and it can be really, really challenging to learn. And so you're not going to be focusing on something like that with kindergartners. Likewise, you don't want to be focusing on grammatical gender with grade 6 students. They should have had much more of a focus on gender earlier on because it's easier to address. You also want to make sure that the language feature is meaningfully and authentically connected to that current subject matter theme or topic. That's all part of the contextualization phase. And then you want to make sure that the learning activity provides for a meaningful context for teaching about and using that language feature, which is really what the awareness and practice phases are in our CAPA sequence. Okay, so take a break right now from this presentation and copy that URL that you see into your browser and watch just a very short 1-minute video. And then come back to this presentation. Okay, so as you saw in that video, it's really the students in the white is what we're really, really focused on, right? And when we're so focused on the students in the white, and that would be parallel to content in the DLI classroom. We're so focused on content in the DLI classroom that we don't notice the moonwalking bear or the grammatical features that show up. So I think that's kind of a fun, and again, that comes from Roy Lister. He's the one that shared that at a conference some years ago, but it's a great metaphor for thinking about how we need to bring students' awareness to particular forms. Okay, so let me give you some examples of contexts and forms that have been developed. For Ojibwe, kindergarten Ojibwe, there is a question marker for yes/no questions called Ina. And the text that was used were puppet dialogues that the teacher and a classroom assistant were doing to demonstrate use of Ina. Grade 1 and 2 for Hmong, measure words that were used in a science unit on animals and their habitats. And the teacher actually created a text, a story about animals and their habitats to make sure that she was using those measure words in a much more frequent way. Grade 3 Spanish, this was done in a two-way context. The teachers were teaching Tommy Ungerer books, specifically the book Crichter, and they found that there were adverb endings in both English and Spanish, and their real emphasis was trying to get the students to write more descriptive texts and so on. And so they had a language arts or literacy unit on storytelling, and they focused on this particular form. Grade 5 Spanish, they were learning the preterite and imperfect past tense aspects in a social studies or language arts unit on biography. And biography is such a great context for past tenses, right? And so the text that they used to initially contextualize this form was a biography on Pelé, a famous soccer player, and I'll show you that in just a moment. And then actually this was grade 6 middle school ESL, looking at participial phrases to indicate cause and effect. So for example, the river washed through the land, comma, causing a canyon or forming a canyon. And so the text that they used for this was a science textbook chapter on landforms. And you're going to see examples of many of these in the activities that I'll show you. Okay, so contextualization. Once you have a text, you've identified a subject matter theme in a linguistic form, and those have been identified. You found a text that is a really good way to contextualize a focus on this particular form. The very first thing that you do is you share the text with a focus on meaning. Remember that hourglass metaphor. We start with a focus on meaning in the contextualization phase, right? And so it's all about making sure that students understand that text. So for example, a story or a chapter could be read aloud to students with follow-up questions to check their comprehension. Students could read independently, followed by a whole class discussion about their understandings and the key concepts. You could show a music video and then have a follow-up discussion about the meaning of the lyrics. Or teacher and a student or a classroom assistant could carry out a dialogue with puppets and then having students act out what they understood. So the whole idea here is to always begin with meaning. Always make sure that the students understand the text that you're going to be using later to bring attention to the form. So this happened in a grade 5 context. The whole CAPA sequence was developed by Katie Perrin and Amy Young some years ago. This is just an excerpt of this text on Pelé, and the whole class actually read the text together and discussed what they learned about Pelé. All right, so now again, I just want to reiterate that the focus during the contextualization phase is on meaning, right? That's what you want to be focusing on, is introducing students to some text, but focusing on what that text means. Okay, so now we're moving into the awareness phase, but first I want to point out that when we're talking about the 2 phases in the middle of that CAPA sequence that really comprise the phases that focus more on language, we've got 3 different kinds of activities: noticing, awareness, and practice activities. And these really lie on a continuum from more receptive activities where we're just listening or understanding versus productive, where the students are actually producing the language. So noticing activities are only receptive. They only fall in the receptive mode. And then awareness activities are both receptive and productive, and then practice activities are much more in the productive mode, but also receptive. But at any rate, these function sort of on a continuum, if you will. And here's a great example of why it's so important to bring students' attention to form. The child says, "I putted the plates on the table." And the mom says, "You mean I put the plates on the table?" And the child says, "No, I putted them on all by myself." This is such a great example of what happens in DLI classrooms because the students are so focused on meaning. They're not paying attention to form. They're focused on meaning, right? All right, so noticing tasks then draw students' attention to problematic features that and these texts then are contrived so that the features appear more salient or more frequent in oral and written input. So for example, if that Pelé text that Amy and Katie had selected didn't have a lot of examples of preterite and imperfect past tenses, then the teacher would need to rewrite the text a little bit to make sure there were enough examples of both of those types of past tenses to be able to make sure that the kids notice them, okay? So sometimes you have to doctor the text, or you have to modify the text a little bit to make sure that the form appears frequently enough. And then you want to enhance the input. So you want to either color code or provide italics or bold facing or underlining, somehow underlining, the form throughout the text to bring students' attention to it, for example. And then if the text happens to be an oral text, if this is a puppet dialogue or if this is a music video or whatever, there has to be some intonational stress that a teacher would use to bring attention to the form. And teachers could also use gestures to do that. And I'll give you some examples here in just a moment of teachers that came out with some really good examples of how to do that. So you want to make sure that both the oral and the written input that students receive has the form with increased frequency, right? Okay, let me give you some examples here. Now this was developed by Monique Paulson, an Ojibwe kindergarten teacher with the Wadukadading program up in Hayward, Wisconsin. These were actually 4-year-olds, or I think they were 5-year-olds actually, developed by Monique. And this was for morning meeting or classroom routines. And I mentioned this earlier, the problematic feature was INA. That's a yes-no question marker, so it's only supposed to appear in questions that would be answered by yes or no. And what the students do is they have a tendency to put INA into their statements. So here is an appropriate question. Do you want to go to the bathroom? And you can see the INA there. And then children saying, instead of saying, I want to drink, they end up saying, do I want to drink? Because they add in that INA there, okay? So you can see how this is supposed to be used. And so what Monique developed for the noticing task was that the teacher was going to work with the classroom elder to model classroom routines with skits using puppets. And then INA was said with intonational stress and a pause, so students were going to notice it. So the bear puppet says, do you want to drink water? And the dog puppet says, yes, I want to drink water. And then this gets repeated again and again and again, all the while really emphasizing that INA that shows up only in the yes-no questions. This was developed by Elizabeth Bigler, who for an English immersion context, this was kindergarten, an early total English immersion program in Japan. The theme was nutrition and healthy behaviors. And the focus was on the third person singular present tense, because one of the things that's really hard for learners of English to acquire is that S on the third person singular forms of present tense verbs in English. And so the text was a book showing pictures of movement and activities to maintain a healthy lifestyle. And what she did is she carried a rubber snake in her hand, and she showed a picture in the book and said she jumps. And she would emphasize the S and wiggle the snake. Okay, she jumps. And she repeated the same gesture and the emphasis on the S each time she introduced another movement. So again, the idea here was to try to bring their attention to that form through intonational stress, and in this case, a gesture as well. So again, these are noticing tasks, okay? Another noticing task was grade 3, preterite and imperfect. This was developed by Kirsten Rue and Amanda Zwiefelhofer. Kirsten is a teacher out in the Minnetonka Public Schools with the Spanish immersion programs. I don't know where Amanda is now. At any rate, the focus was on preterite and imperfect past tenses, and the kids had read Cinderella, and then they showed parts of the text of Cinderella, and they highlighted the imperfect forms in yellow and the preterite forms in blue. So again, this is just a noticing task. The students aren't doing anything really than just listening. Remember, noticing tasks are receptive only. Okay? And then Katie Perrin and Amy Young, you might recall that Pele text that I mentioned a few moments ago. What they did is what they called a directed highlighting activity, where 2 students were reading aloud with the teacher. One student, Alex, was instructed to read all the verbs that were highlighted in yellow. So in other words, the 2 volunteer students were up at the front of the classroom with the teacher, and Alex got a copy of the text with words highlighted in yellow, and Juliana got a copy of the text with words highlighted in green. And then meanwhile, all the students were at their desk. They had a copy of the text that had no highlighting, and then they were instructed to highlight all the yellow words that Alex said. So they had to highlight in yellow all of the words that Alex would say, and in green all the words that Juliana says. Okay? So as you can see here, Alex's were the preterite forms, and Juliana's were the imperfect forms. So that's all they did. As the teacher read the narrative, and then each time she came to a highlighted word, Alex would say fue. So the teacher would say pero Pelé no, and then Alex would say fue, and the teacher would continue siempre tan famoso al principio, and then Juliana says era, right? So you get the idea here, and then the kids are highlighting these at their desks. Okay, and then another noticing task, ESL grade 6. This was developed by Carrie McGuire, who's now a professor at Augsburg College. The context again was ESL science, landforms, participial phrases for indicating cause and effect, and emphasis is on the participial phrase set off by the comma at the end of a sentence. So the running water of the river wears away the ground, comma, forming a canyon. And so this came directly from the textbook, where there were very different kinds of pictures and multiple sentences showing this particular participial phrase. And so the sentences, this was part of the noticing activity. So after they had read that chapter, that Carrie had taken these sentences from the modified text, and then she matched them with pictures on this PowerPoint presentation. And then what she would do is she showed a PowerPoint slide, and she would ask the students to describe what they saw in each picture, and then she would add the text and then ask a student to read the sentence aloud. And then she was having the students say comma, and then drawing a comma in the air when they reached the end of the first clause, and then after the comma, the class and the teacher would say the participial adjective or the ing form with extra stress on that ing. Okay, so for example, the very first one would be lava flows up through a crack in the earth and hardens, comma, and then creating a mountain. You get the idea here. So the students are seeing it with the enhanced text that's in bold, but also changing some intonational stress and including a gesture of writing the comma in the air to draw students' attention to this particular feature. Okay, so that gives you a good set of examples of noticing tasks. And then after noticing, we move into, this is still the awareness phase, but we move into awareness tasks. So awareness tasks are great because noticing activities are really important to start with, but they're insufficient on their own. Remember, they're only receptive. So students are only sort of really noticing the form in some important way, but they haven't yet figured out how the form works or what the rules might be, and so on and so forth. So in the awareness phase, that's really what it's about. These are activities that engage learners in some degree of language analysis or reflection through rule discovery, through opportunities to compare language patterns, metalinguistic information, and so on. So for example, if we take a look at the, go back to that kindergarten English immersion context where the students were learning to put the S on the third person singular present tense forms in English. Remember, she jumps with the wiggling snake. The teacher asked the students to identify a signal for the sound S. I can't remember what they did. I think they had like a flat hand, but, you know, sort of set vertically and then kind of moving it. I think they did that, or maybe they drew an S in the air. I can't remember what they did, but she had them come up with some kind of a gesture signal for that. And then she introduced the phrases with more pictures in the book. She modeled that hand signal, encouraged students to use it each time the S is needed. So this is all still sort of noticing. Remember, these kind of function on a continuum. And then she asked students to explain why the S is needed. Which kinds of words are taking that S where we're making that movement and so on. And that's where the students start to begin to try to figure out what this is all about, right? And so they start to produce some language here. They start to produce explanations and so on. And now you've moved into awareness. This was developed by Rayanne Shelley, a kindergarten teacher, a Spanish program out in Utah. The linguistic feature was the subject-verb agreement, specifically for first person, singular and plural, and then third person singular. So, for example, in English, that would be I have, she has, we have, okay? And for very basic verbs like to have and to be. And then the students, and the reason she was doing this was because students were saying things like yo tiene, which means I has, instead of yo tengo, meaning I have. And so she did this in the context of math. And so what she did is she had pictures, she had these, the pictures I just chose from the internet here. But what she did is she had a picture of herself, and she made a hand gesture, and she'd say yo, that means I, and then put her hand on her chest, yo. So in other words, I'm talking about me, right? And then with él or ella, he or she extended her hand with the palm up and then pointed to a girl or a boy, okay? And so she was teaching the kids these gestures. And then for nosotros, or we, she started with her fingers pointed at her chest and then swept out her fingers in a circle and back to the chest to show that she's talking about everybody, that everybody's included here. It's kind of hard to do this without being able to show you exactly what that looked like. So then with using math concepts and working with counters, the teacher was modeling, I have 5 tokens. She has, or counters, she has 3. Together, we have 8. So you can see here that she's really trying to focus this on math, but at the same time get them to use these verbs appropriately in the context of joining sets. Make sense? Then going back to the fairy tale example with Cinderella, you might remember. So they had yellow and blue highlighting. The students had to copy the color-coded words from the Cinderella text on blue or yellow paper, according to how they were highlighted in the text. And then in pairs, they had to cut out the words, and then they had to group the words, looking for patterns that they noticed. And then the students would share their word findings and groupings with another pair. And then as a class, they were going to discuss what they found. So the teacher's really trying to bring their attention to the fact that verb endings change, okay? And hopefully she's trying to get them to see that particular verbs change, particular types of verbs, like if the verb ends in AR, the endings are going to be different than if the verb ends in an ER or an IR. And then she had the students do language diary entry. They had discovered word patterns and discussed finding groupings and conclusions with their class, and then they wrote the language rule in their own words in their notebook. And then in the diary, they had to answer questions, what have I learned? What's the meaning of what I've learned? What are some examples? And as you can see here, the real focus was getting them to understand how this particular form works, okay? And so what also happens during this kind of activity is that the teacher needs to come in and start providing them with some really good explanations here. And this is where the teacher might come in and teach the fact that there are AR, ER, and IR verbs, and that we take off the AR to get the verb stem, right? Or we take off the IR to get the verb stem, and then we add on endings, and endings correspond to different people, okay? So that's the kind of teaching that you would have to do. So keep in mind, that's so different from teaching verb conjugations in a really decontextualized way. I hope you're seeing the difference there. At any rate, during the awareness phase, the teacher definitely needs to come in and provide some explanation about how that grammatical form works if the students aren't able to really home in on exactly what the rules are and so on. And boy, preterite and imperfect past tenses are super complicated in Spanish. They're complicated in terms of how they are created, but they're also complicated in terms of when to use them. So this is the kind of thing that would require a lot of teacher input and explanation as well. Oops. And then going back to that, the Katie Perrin and Amy Young, remember they did that directed highlighting activity with the biography on Pelé. And after the directed highlighting activity, the students were placed in groups, and they had to write preterite verbs in one column, so the yellow verbs in one column and the green verbs in another column, and they had to come up with a rule for why they would use each one. So it was a little more complicated for grade 5 and so on. And then going back finally to the grade 6 ESL example, students had to return to the text and circle all the sentences with that participial phrase, remember the comma and the ing form, and then they'd highlight the comma with one color and the participle with another. So first they had to circle the sentences they were looking for, then highlight the comma, then highlight the participle. And then teacher and students examined those highlighted sentences, and they discussed how they showed cause and effect. And then with a partner, students completed the following graphic organizer to identify and analyze the highlighted sentences to determine which action happened first and which one was caused by the first action. So you can see here she's really trying to help them to understand how grammatically cause and effect is described. This is so great in showing you how you can teach academic language, right? And so first they had to describe the first action, this is the rule that they came up with. After they'd gone through this, the teacher guided them in this inductive rule discovery activity, pushing the students to describe the purpose and the rules of participial phrases, and this is more or less the definition they came up with. And then this is what you get. This was the end of it. So this is the end of this very first PowerPoint that really emphasizes the contextualization and awareness phases, and also provided you with some more background.